She was, I think, a modern woman before her time.
Mrs. Wright, in my estimation, was a saint, like Saint Francis.
She really was a kind of American royalty, and like all royalty, she both gave and she demanded.
Very powerful, extremely so. My Lord, what a temper she had.
I like her and don't like her. I loved her, I hated her, I despised her. I had every emotion that goes in a human relationship with her.
They were human, my grandparents. They were not gods. They were human.
He said, "What do you know about architecture?" Oh, I said, "Everything. I have been with you 35 years.
He was America's most famous and flamboyant architect. She was a smoldering Montenegrin beauty who had fled revolutionary Russia with Bolshevik troops at her heels. Together they wrote a chronicle of ego and tenderness, passion and creativity, scandal and towering artistic achievement unparalleled in this century. He was Frank Lloyd Wright. She was a partner to genius. Hello, I'm Jim Auer, and it's my privilege to introduce you to the most determined, reclusive, mystical, and altogether fascinating woman I've ever met. Her full name, Olga Ivanovna Lazovich Hinzenberg Lloyd Wright. Her friends called her Olgivana. The world called her Mrs. Frank Lloyd Wright. Over the 20 years that I knew her, I discovered that she was a queen with two kingdoms, both fashioned by America's undisputed master of organic architecture, Frank Lloyd Wright. The first kingdom, the original Taliesin, is the definitive statement of Wright's early prairie period. It was first occupied in 1911, here in the gently rolling hills near Spring Green in south-central Wisconsin. The second kingdom, Taliesin West, was begun in 1938 on 600 boulder and cactus-strewn acres of the Great Maricopa Mesa northeast of Phoenix, Arizona. From 1925 until her death in 1985, Olgivana Lloyd Wright reigned unquestioned over these two domains. A stately figure, alternately imperious and down-to-earth, she played many roles: lover and organizer, critic and counselor, peacemaker and homemaker. She alone, among Wright's three wives, was able to match wits and creative insights with the tempestuous artistic genius. Together with Wright, she set up a school of architecture that engulfed every aspect of its students' lives. She was a published author of books and newspaper columns. She originated musical themes based on the Slavic melodies of her Montenegrin girlhood. She mounted spectacular dance dramas in the theater at Taliesin West. In concert with Wright, she worked out the color schemes for some of his most famous buildings. And somehow, she found time to serve as a mentor to young architects who came to Taliesin to study and to learn.
When I first came to the fellowship and thought of Mrs. Wright as the wisest and most beautiful woman I would ever meet, my intuition was right.
I didn't even know Mrs. Wright existed when I came to the fellowship. I came because of Mr. Wright. I was so enthralled with the beauty of the buildings, and here I saw a person that matched that beauty.
The impact of her personality on these young apprentices was enormous. Even greater was her influence on America's foremost architect. In 1924, when they met, Frank Lloyd Wright was an embattled, if not embittered man. His time of greatness, it seemed, was well behind him. The lyrical, prairie-styled homes, the Larkin Building in Buffalo, the magnificent Roby House in Chicago, the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, which had survived a catastrophic earthquake, all were in the past. At 57, with his finances flagging, it was obvious to many that Frank Lloyd Wright's career had peaked. How it all happened is the heady stuff of romantic fiction. Consider the protagonists. Olgivana Lazovich Hinzenberg, born to aristocratic parents in the tiny Principality of Montenegro on December 27, 1898. Her mother was a general in the Montenegrin army. Her father, a Montenegrin Supreme Court justice who had gone blind.
And she became his eyes, which means that as a young child she had to read to him the political papers, the newspapers, the court reports, the philosophers, the writers, the literature of the time.
Much of my interest in philosophy and literature, and as a matter of fact in politics, because I had to read the newspapers to him, which I didn't care for, came through that influence.
When Mrs. Wright was old enough to really start to school, she was sent to live in Russia with her older sister, who had married a noble Russian, and they lived in Tiflis. She lived there up until the time of the Russian Revolution.
And she got on the last train that left Russia and went to Turkey. And her sister saw her off, and of course she never saw or heard from her sister again. Something that's caused her great pain all her life.
Mrs. Wright fell in love with the gypsies. They were marvelous people. And she went to a gypsy fortune teller who read the tea leaves and said, "You're going to go on a long voyage overseas, and when you get at the end, the rest of your life will be concerned with squares, circles, and triangles." And when she came to America, she met Frank Lloyd Wright.
Now consider the other half of the equation. Frank Lloyd Wright, the gifted, headstrong scion of a clan of sturdy Welsh farmers, the Lloyd Joneses. He was born June 8, 1867, in Richland Center, Wisconsin, and trained briefly at the University of Wisconsin. He enjoyed considerably more success with his early architectural career than with his two failed marriages. In 1909, Wright had left his first wife, Catherine, and their 6 children in order to set up a new life with his mistress, Mama Borthwick Cheney, the spouse of a former client. The lovers set up housekeeping at Taliesin, and then on an awful afternoon in 1914, Mama Borthwick, her 2 children, and 4 others were murdered. The killer, a demented cook, also set the house afire. Later, unwisely, Wright married an opportunistic poet and mystic, Miriam Noel. They separated after 6 months, yet she pursued him for years, refusing his pleas for a divorce. It was against this background of soaring ambition and harrowing tragedy that Frank and Olgivana first laid eyes on each other. They met appropriately at the ballet. The place, Chicago. The year, 1924. The chemistry, immediate and, as it turned out, long-lasting. Olgivana, unhappily married to a Russian architect 10 years her senior, was in the United States with her 7-year-old daughter, Svetlana. Frank, rancorously separated from the possessive Miriam, was seated in the box with several male friends.
The way my father and mother met, I think, was destiny, although it seems like accident.
Frank Lloyd Wright wrote about that moment in his autobiography. A quick, comprehending glance from the young woman with the sensitive, feminine brow and dark eyes. Was she a Russian princess? The glance went home. A strange elation stole over me.
They just simply fell deeply in love with each other, almost at first glance. She had never heard of him, never heard his name, rang nothing with her.
And Mrs. Wright described it as 2 powerful magnets being drawn together, like that.
This strange chance meeting was poetry for a man hungry for poetry.
My life started then. And he told me, "Olgivana, from this time on, you won't be seen for the dust." And he was right.
The contrast between the two could scarcely have been greater. He silver-haired and dashing, She a darkly ravishing beauty with the soul of a poet and the body of an accomplished dancer. The difference in their ages, 30 years. In their backgrounds, half a globe. In their personalities, oil and water, buckskin and silk. Frank and Olgivanna could not marry, so they did the next best thing. They lived together at Taliesin while seeking their respective divorces. Needless to say, tongues wagged in Spring Green. From the very beginning, their alliance was a tempestuous one. Born in scandal, it matured publicly and spectacularly. There were lurid newspaper accounts and unkind jokes.
That isn't all his fault. It's also the fault of the people who judged harshly a situation of which he was victim. The wife doesn't give the divorce. What can he do? He loves the woman, so he takes it. With that go all these disagreeable experiences.
In 1925, the great house at Taliesin burned again. Later that year, their only child, Jovana, was born, joining Olgivanna's daughter, Svetlana, whom Wright would adopt. Through it all, his estranged wife, Miriam, sought to catch the lovers in every snare her lawyers could devise. At one point, the great architect and his highborn companion were jailed overnight like common criminals. The charges were dropped, but the headlines were unforgettable.
It meant a very arduous choice for her to make. To live with a man where they could not be married, they had a child, that was 4 years before they could get married, they were hounded by the press, hounded by the banks, hounded by his former wife.
And in my time, I had to win Spring Green and Madison, not everybody rushing out to see what I looked like. But I would go to town. It wasn't pleasant, no. But we couldn't get divorced again. And yet we didn't want to waste a life which we made very constructive here, even without money.
They were bankrupt, and yet they both had the feeling of nothing before them except a glorious future, because they had themselves and they had their faith in each other.
Frank and Olgivanna held on, and in 1928, 4 years after they met, they finally, formally married.
She felt the animosity of the Wisconsin population from her very difficult experiences when she first came to Taliesin, whereas in Arizona, she moved in a different circle there, people who were more liberated themselves, I guess you would say. They were more accepting of her and her life.
An idea was germinating for a second Taliesin in the arid Southwest, far from Wisconsin's chilly winters and frosty glances. In 1929, Wright was in Arizona working on designs for a resort. Here, outside Phoenix, Olgivanna began a lifelong love affair with the desert. As she wrote many years later, "We were in terrible financial straits, yet miracles happen to those that have faith. I believed that before long we could have a home in this beautiful desert." Alas, the stock market crash put an end to the project. Wright moved into writing and lecturing. Then his wife came up with a transformative idea: a school of architecture. The campus? Taliesin itself.
She said to him, "Frank, all your life you've had hired draftsmen. They come in, they work for you from 9 to 5, they go out, and when they're through, they take your ideas and steal them. Why don't you have a school where the people who come in will be like apprentices to you?"
And I said, you shouldn't leave only buildings behind, you should leave men imbued with an idea of beauty. And he said, well, maybe it is a good idea. So then we got this plan, which we altered as we went along. And finally, the young people came, first just 23. We were hardly finished to house them. They had to carry their own doors still, you know. I said, let them start that way. They are architects, they will know how a building depends on knowledge of mechanics as well as on knowledge of beauty.
And their idea was that rather than just sitting at an armchair or behind a desk and learning architecture, the architects had to learn something about the materials of the building. They had to learn something about building, actually the building themselves. They had to learn how a building was maintained. So what they found, there was really not an educational program as it was an apprenticeship program.
The result was a school like no other, encompassing all aspects of the apprentices' lives. Its motto, learning by doing. Young, tuition-paying residents learned how to work. More important, they learned how to learn, designing, drafting, drawing, working with Frank Lloyd Wright. In whatever time was left, they cooked, farmed, tended the animals, repaired existing buildings, constructed new ones. Leavening the hard work were music, dance, literature, and stimulating discussions. Inevitably, they grew as artists and as functioning human beings.
That way, we both hoped that will not only make architects, but capable men with integrity, men that can uphold the principle no matter what disaster strikes the world, no matter what ideologies might suddenly overwhelm the world. And that is why we had you all participate in our social life, in our music, chamber orchestra, choir, solo work, dance, everything you could think of to develop an individual who is not narrowly looking at one spot with the blinders on his eyes, but that he is completely free, that he can turn in any direction and be able to discern truth.
And it was really a remarkable undertaking for two people at that time, because it was in the depth of the Depression and there was no work at Taliesin, so we spent a lot of our time out in the fields and doing thrashing and all the things that one does, gardening and so forth. And in the winter, when the men were busy out in the field, in the forest cutting logs, and sometimes we were too, but if there was free time, we were apt to spend it with Mrs. Wright.
Formal Saturday evenings allowed apprentices to polish their social skills. After a week of hard work, they donned tuxedos and evening gowns to mingle with noted guests.
Mr. Wright always felt that at Taliesin he wanted a person to be equally at home with a Wisconsin farmer or the Queen of England, and Mrs. Wright was the one who made that possible.
I have the feeling that had Frank Lloyd Wright been a doctor or a lawyer or some other kind of person other than an architect, that there still would have been a fellowship with Mrs. Wright's involvement, and that human side of it, that psychological side of it, that demand of performance and commitment would have been the same. And that the fact that this place had to do with architecture was really almost secondary in her focus.
The working of the fellowship was more Olgivanna Wright's responsibility than her husband's. Indeed, with its stress on personal development and hands-on training, the fellowship took its cue directly from her own experiences a decade and a half earlier with her mentor, G.I. Gurdjieff.
He was like the sun, Mr. Gurdjieff. When he came into a room, say there were lots of people in the room, he came in, it was just as if the sun rose. He had about him a certain emanation or radiation, I suppose you would say, of goodness, power, and understanding.
Georgy Ivanovich Gurdjieff was born on the Russian-Turkish border to a Greek father and an Armenian mother. Erudite, magnetic, opinionated, he was a philosopher who transfixed and controlled his followers. His curriculum was rigorous, employing dance, exercise, sacrifice, physical labor, and psychological discipline. These practices had an enormous impact on his loyal student, Olgivanna, who had joined in 1917.
His school was called the Harmonious Development for Man, and it believed that you develop man's mind, you develop the heart, and you develop the body all the time, same time, to produce a complete person.
It seemed almost like fate that she and Gurdjieff met, because If she hadn't met him, I don't know if she would have been exactly who she was later.
I think if you read about Gurdjieff's life, you're not quite sure whether he was a savior or a monster.
He was strong and strict and a person who resisted change. In Mrs. Wright, he found someone who was very flexible.
And when I went there, Gurdjieff was very kind and told me that I had unusual depth of understanding, but I needed worldliness.
When she first met him, when she first saw him, she knew she had found a philosopher that could help her. And he said, "What do you want in life?" And she said, "Immortality." Oh, ho, ho. He said, that's not passed on a platter. For that, you struggle and you suffer. And she did that. She went with him for 7 years.
One time he made her walk across the desert. She had street shoes on, and he made her walk in her shoes across the stones and everything, and her feet were hurting or bleeding. And she said to him, "Why are you doing this to me?" He said, "That's the first time you've worked for a meal in your life, and I want to make you strong." She would go through anything then. She believed him utterly. I mean, she was a classic disciple in that way.
Mrs. Wright was frail physically, but very strong in spirit. And she could go along and stand anything.
In the Institute, I did all those things that I knew nothing about. He was absolutely wonderful to supply me with the things that counted, he said, only if they are related in some way to you. Theories are nothing. Throw them all out.
In a sense, she did not mimic Gurdjieff, but her whole outlook on life was filled with the similar type philosophy. And basically what it amounted to was, I can't do anything for you, you've got to do it for yourself.
And one time she said, "What will become of you when something happens to me?" I was so struck. I said, "Well, nothing wrong will happen to me. I have it all inside here. I can do anything. I can go wash the dishes. I can go dig the ditches. I can go to cook. I can go to teach dance. I can go to speak to them." And he just turned his head away, pleased.
Gurdjieff said, "It is time for you to leave. You've been with me 7 years. You've learned just about all you can from me. You need to go to America and start a school." I think it is absolutely amazing that a few years later she meets Frank Lloyd Wright. A few years later there is the evolution of the Taliesin Fellowship. What was beautifully formulated was a school that dealt with the principles of building a person from the ground up, that was not perceived as being esoteric, but was based in common sense.
That is why he decided to have Taliesin Fellowship. It started long ago, I believe in 1932. And the philosophy that went with it was potent philosophy, because it had this principle of continuity, and in order to maintain that principle, it had to be accompanied by action. No idleness was permitted at Taliesin. No leisure that was not a constructive leisure. And the hard work struck the young people the first day they put their foot on Taliesin ground.
The effects of the Great Depression were felt keenly at Taliesin. With clients scarce and cash even scarcer, the students proved enormously useful, as did their tuition checks. Olgivanna's philosophy, honed through her long, arduous apprenticeship with Gurdjieff, helped her to survive these hardest of hard times.
The Depression was such that Mrs. Wright had no money to buy dresses for her girls, Svetlana and Ivana, and she used the pongee curtains and made dresses from the pongee curtains that were in the living room.
Through it all, Taliesin remained vibrant, dynamic, alive. Jenkin Lloyd Jones, a distant relative of Wright's, wrote many years later, "But Taliesin was no house of a busted genius. There was a brave illusion of opulence. However sparse the supper, vases were ablaze with summer flowers, or in wintertime with pussy willows and bittersweet. Tables were loaded with bowls of red apples from the orchard on the hill. This was all Gavana's doing. However bare the cupboard, she was born with a touch of richness."
Both Mr. and Mrs. Wright had a sort of a similar feeling about finances, which is certainly very radical, certainly very unconventional. And they spent most of their life in debt or very close to the margin because they bought beautiful things, and those are the things which are important to them. One time, Mrs. Wright came into the living room and said, "Well, Frank, how much money do we have in all?" "Just what I have in my pocket." I took out, this is no banking out, just in my pocket. "Spend it," she said, "so we'll get some more." They went out, spent it, and the next morning came a letter from Kaufman to design Falling Water.
Falling Water, in Pennsylvania, signal a renaissance in Wright's fortunes. Suddenly he began to do great architecture again. In his words, ideas were spilling out of his sleeve and onto the paper. Finally, Mrs. Wright's dream of a desert home could come true.
All of that was a result of the combination of the chemistry of Frank Lloyd Wright and old Gavana Lloyd Wright.
I think it was a general stimulation of a younger woman for an older man. She kept him alive. I think that his most creative period began almost, you can almost date it with their courtship and so forth.
Mrs. Wright gave Mr. Wright an energy to go from prose to poetry. Mrs. Wright started to enter into Mr. Wright's life, and his architecture became softer, more feminine. The curve in the circle began to enter more and more into the plan and into the elevation. And it was then that Mr. Wright started to use the terms that were natural. So what Mrs. Wright did was make his work humane.
She was aware of the fact that his genius lay in his power of absorption. You presented a good idea to him and he absorbed it. A very simple example, a very basic example of it, is when they were walking one day in Wisconsin between Hillside and Taliesin, two of our buildings, and Mrs. Wright said, "Look, Frank, look at those cows. They look like crumpled up newspapers on the landscape, black and white." And he said, "Well, the Holstein's the best milk cow there is." He was always a farmer, born and raised a farmer, loved farming. But she said, "Think how wonderful the Guernseys would look. That Titian red, that chestnut red on that beautiful green." "No," he said, "they can't compare to the Holsteins." The next day he went to the Farm Bureau and made an arrangement to sell the Guernseys, sell the Holsteins and buy the Guernseys. And someone said, "Well, how come you're selling up all your Holsteins and switching over the Guernseys?" "Well," said Mr. Wright, "it occurred to me the other day that the Holsteins just looked like crumpled up newspapers on the landscape." Now, it's not that he was forgetting the idea came from her, or belittling her, or taking the credit away from her. What he was doing was absorbing what he thought was a good idea. And she, knowing that, could feed him the ideas.
Mrs. Wright influenced Mr. Wright a great deal in many ways, but one of them was in the type of color that he used. She had a remarkable sense of color. And whereas Mr. Wright had used very neutral